Hi, and welcome back to the additional recording for week 4. To start proceedings, can you please open up the PowerPoint to slide 28? What you'll find there is a screenshot of a document that is produced or has been reproduced on the internet regarding onions and flu prevention and virus absorbent qualities, or the virus absorbent qualities of onions. I apologise. I know the quality is poor, however, if you either stretch or change the size of the actual screen, you should be able to read this with no problem. The questions that are under in the notes, of the slideshow itself, reappear on page or slide 29 and slide 30. So don't worry too much about what you can read or can't read under the notes section of the actual slide. The crucial thing is that you make some sort of, attempt to read through the information and actually see, without actually considering it too strongly, at least certainly not initially, or too critically, think about whether the information is plausible or not. Now, questions like, what do you know about the flu? What do you know about onions, as I've posed on slide 29, should give you some initial guide as to whether the information is plausible or not. I'll let you obviously come to your initial conclusions. However, if you dig a little bit deeper, if you're a little bit more critical, you may start to ask questions like, could this actually be true? How could it actually be true? What mechanisms perhaps within an onion might, sufficiently explain something like this? So from going to perhaps maybe something that looks slightly plausible, or even in some instances it might be completely plausible depending on your perspective, and then drilling down into what you actually know about these things and going beyond that to ask more critical questions, you may come up with a slightly different answer. I think the main point that I'm trying to get to with this type of exercise is to actually get you to start thinking beyond what we often take as superficial information that we don't question and we allow often to float around as half-truths, to actually, as I say, drill down a little bit deeper and work out whether these kind of things are simply almost fables, mythology that's built up or constructed around certain things and that we don't necessarily always question. If you've already questioned this right from the bat, good on you. That means you're obviously a critical thinker already. And the extension activity on slide 30 provides a framework or a structure, a positivist approach or a scientific approach to actually attempting to actually ascertain whether this claim is actually true or not. So we want to work out some way of verifying or finding the validity in such a claim, and the questions I've posed there any experimenter would do. So the first thing is, obviously you have to design an experiment that will test obviously the variables within the actual experiment itself, come up with a reasonable methodology, and whilst that might seem a big ask from here, all you have to do is alternatively think about how could you test in any shape or form this particular claim. And it would be interesting to hear what you come up with at home, beyond my kind of experimental model. Now, activity 2 on slide 31, asks students to write a diary. And it's fairly easy because most people have been I've asked for the first 2 weeks of their experience at university, and most people have had a lot of nerves, a lot of excitement about being at university, for instance, started new things, new possibilities, and that's always a positive time. What I get them to do is do, 2 paragraphs for those 2 weeks, and then they hand it on to the person next to them to read it and interpret their work. And what I get them to do, that is the reader, the person who receives the actual entry, is to then to do an interpretation of what those 2 entries might mean. So in other words, weeks 1 and week 2. In terms of their interpretation, we then usually go around the room and find out whether their interpretation is an accurate rendering of the primary source, because obviously we're talking about primary and secondary sources, as you'll see by the caption up the top of the slide. Having said that, what we often find is that interpretations, whilst accurate, may have slight variations, and what I'm trying to highlight by doing an exercise like this is to determine, what if there is distortions or changes or differences in interpretations of things, how does that affect our overall interpretation of a particular event? And so I'm broadening this out from an isolated case or an individual case in terms of a diary into something more generalised. So looking at maybe even history of an event. Okay, what do people say about a particular thing, and what does that mean in terms of an amalgam of information that's collected? You could think of a collage. So we have multiple views of particular things. But then if you actually focus just on one or two of those individual interpretations within that sort of mosaic or within that collage, and just looked at those particular frames, you might come up with a fairly different interpretation than when you're looking at the whole picture. And I suppose that's the point, that these things are interpreted or interpretive, and so we can come up with very different answers or renderings of a particular event, an incident, a historical occasion, for instance. The other crucial point here is that there is a fundamental difference between primary and secondary sources. So if I'm reading someone's diary, I've got direct access to their thoughts and feelings. However, if I'm reading a secondary source, i.e. the person who's read that particular source in the classroom, and then I do an interpretation of that, then I'm reading it through second eyes. So I'm actually got possibly a very different take. So it's slanted, or it's coloured or flavoured in some way by the reader. So their subjectivity will influence their interpretation of the account that they've read. So for you guys, the argument would always be, do I go to a primary source or do I go to secondary? And it always depends on the work that you're doing. Now, the optional third activity, this is really for anyone who's got the book by Jean Brick called Academic Culture. If you do have that, this exercise is from that particular book, and it's worth considering, because there's 5 sources that you have to actually read through and ascertain the legitimacy, the validity, the reliability of the information that's being presented in each of those 5 resources or sources. And again, if you're at home and if you have the time, by all means, like I said, I would undertake this exercise. I think it's just a good exploration of information, and I highly recommend it if you can. And obviously it's recommended in your distance guide. The last exercise, which is Ingar Clendenden's incident on a beach, for me is kind of it's not necessarily that easy to do in terms of actually getting the article. If you can go to a local library, you can get access to the article. I was tempted to photocopy it and put it up, but because it's an optional activity, I didn't want to flood Milo with a whole range of different activities. However, if you really want to have a look at this, I can send you a photocopy. By all means, contact me. My email address, I should say, is on the unit outline, and I can send you a copy of it if you want to consider doing this exercise. It's interesting because it's a historical account of an event, and the questions, and certainly coming from my perspective, from a history background, I've studied a lot of history, questions that relate to the particular incident, so particularly the truth of an account and what facts emerge from that, whatever facts means in this particular incident, are very interesting in terms of exploring these avenues of information and how we arrive at answers from information that we have. And ultimately about perspectives, because literally history is about perspectives. Anyway, there's at least 4 things to get on if you've got the time to do all of them. It would be great. If not, like I said, pick and choose the ones that you think are more accessible and more useful to you. Beyond that, have a great week, as I've already said. Enjoy yourselves. Bye.